Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining the session on AI regulation and the future of work at the Reshape Work conference. My name's Alex Shee, and I'll be moderating today's conference, or at least today's panel. Um, as we were preparing for this session, I was reflecting on how AI has been advancing so rapidly. And with it, the incredible potential that it brings new ways of working, tremendous productivity gains, and a chance to create transformational value for businesses, workers, and society. But it also kept me up because that potential isn't guaranteed. Um, in my opinion, without proper guardrails, the same systems that could empower people may instead increase precarity, surveillance, and inequality. Um, and that's the challenge I think we have before us. And I think that's the conversation that we want to have today about the how regulation and governance can keep pace with innovation so that workers benefit rather than be left behind. Um, and I'm hopeful that if the right frameworks are put in place, AI can truly contribute to a fairer, safer, and more rewarding forms of work and potentially um, a more prosperous society. To help explore that, I'm excited to participate in this conversation with four leading voices. Janine Berg is a senior economist at the ILO, but she's been a driving force behind a lot of global labor standards and protecting workers' rights. And she's someone that is extremely well respected, but also a strong voice in that conversation. Stijn Broecke is a senior economist at OECD who studies how governments can respond to the challenges and opportunities of technology and AI, and is truly one of the people that governments around the world go to see to get an enlightened perspective and viewpoint on where things are going and how it's impacting society. So someone that's very much at the center of conversations. Sarah Lucena is the founder and CEO of Mappa. So we wanted to really bring the perspective of a startup founder, and she recently just raised a round, a financing round, so that which is quite exciting. And she's really working at the cutting edge of innovation. And Stefan Seidel is a professor of information systems at the University of Cologne, where his research focuses on algorithmic systems and their impacts on organizations and society. And he's someone where a lot of the foundational thinking is being brought up, and where people are looking to get a very nuanced, thoughtful, and objective way of looking at how the impacts are there. So over the next 45 minutes, we're going to try to aim to go beyond abstract principles and look at where regulation is succeeding, where it's lagging, and what are the practical levers, policy, entrepreneurial, academic, that we can use to ensure AI truly works for people. So on that note, let me kick it off with Janine. Janine, let's start with you. What do you think are some of the biggest concerns for workers about the adoption of AI at the workplace? And maybe just to push it a little bit more, how do you think these concerns could best be addressed?
Okay, well, I think one of the major concerns that's on the top of people's minds, and something that's also driven a lot by media discussions, is job loss. So people, particularly in some occupations which are at high risk of automation, are worried that they could be replaced by the technology, that they could be out of work. And in a period of, technological disruption, it could be hard to find new employment. We've done studies on what is the potential for automation, and while we don't find that the sky is falling, there is nonetheless a core group of occupations that are at risk. Our data shows an upper threshold around the world of about 3.3% of jobs that could be or at high risk of automation. And in high income countries, this is much higher at about 6%. And then it's even higher for women because many women are in clerical support occupations, which tend to be the occupations that are most at risk of job loss. So that's one issue. But then the other issue, and this is perhaps the broader issue, is really about working conditions. So many more jobs, we know from our statistics, are at risk of being transformed, or not at risk, will likely be transformed, just like our own jobs transform every day with digitalization. So we estimate about 190 million jobs in high-income countries that could be transformed. Now, this transformation, it can be a very positive thing or it can be a negative thing. It's exactly what you were saying, Alex. It really depends on how that transformation takes place. It could be, it could be something that we're using AI to improve occupational safety and health. Let's say a manager is informed when a construction worker's walks into a dangerous part of a construction site, for example. That's a very positive use. But it could also be that people's emails and conversations and everything they do is tracked and monitored. And then that could have a deterioration in working conditions that could increase surveillance and psychosocial risks. Similarly, the benefit could be that routine tasks are automated, but the drawback could be that we have less autonomy to decide what we do in our jobs. This is something, for example, that call center workers have experienced. There's also risks of less human interaction if it's algorithms that are taking the decisions of management. So, how do we address these concerns? I mean, is this something that really one can't wait until it happens and then address it? And this is really why we put out these numbers. It's really important that policymakers and employers and workers' organizations and workers themselves be very involved in these discussions, which is why a fora like these are so important. That there really be a concerted policy effort to see, what are the red lines that we need to make sure that we respect. And also, how can we integrate the technology in a way that's beneficial for the workers? And this is something that we really need to have a conversation about.
Yeah, and I put in the chat some of the recent generative AI and jobs update that that was published by the ILO, which you co-authored. And I think one of the things that when I was reading through some of the research that you were doing is that there truly is a disproportional impact on women and job loss on women. And I think that's something that's being a little bit put under the rug in terms of the global conversation. We're not speaking enough about how that's particularly impacting women and oftentimes in clerical jobs in developing nations, which will have a disproportional impact in the long term, and something to kind of think about. So that was extremely concrete, and I appreciate kind of you bringing your research and all of the thoughts that you have into some distilled thinking. And I think that international level that you're talking about and those concrete worker concerns transition well to Stijn, where I would like to kind of understand how governments and global institutions are responding to that. So, Stijn, where do you see the greatest risk for workers and the biggest gaps in legislation?
Thanks, Alex. So I think Janine already gave a really nice overview of the risks, and I think we're broadly agreed on risks across countries and organizations, etc. And I think the big question is how we address those risks. And I think what we do about the risks depends to a large extent on existing regulation and institutions in countries. And I think their countries do vary. And so where the biggest gaps are depends, I think, to some extent on which country we are talking about. But I do want to, I think, pick up on two issues in particular, which I think see gaps even in, say, the region like the EU, which is, well, as I see it, one of the better protected, where workers are best protected. But even there, I see significant gaps. And I think that's come to the fore with a recent study that we did at the OECD on algorithmic management, which showed how prevalent the use of these tools already is. Now, in most cases, these tools are relatively benign. They're often simple kind of, clocking in, clocking out kind of things, monitoring whether work is being done, that kind of tool. It's just the automation of those things, and that's relatively benign. But the study also uncovered much more intrusive uses of algorithmic management and also the issue of automated decision making. So if I can pick up on two issues, I think the first one would be automated decision making and kind of the regulation around that. And the second I would like to highlight is data protection and privacy. So on the first issue, we are increasingly, as I said, in the workplace, seeing tools that make automated decisions or recommendations regarding workers or future workers, say job applicants. And I personally think that regulation here has gaps, even in the EU. So in the EU, we have the GDPR, which, and here I quote, data subjects shall have the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing. But even in the EU, there are a lot of issues with this. So first of all, we could argue that very few decisions are or rely only or solely on automated processing. I think it's pretty easy to argue that there's a human in the loop, but what that human in the loop actually means could be very superficial, and so offer little protection to those workers or applicants who are affected by these decisions. Second, in the GDPR, there are lots of exceptions to this rule. So there are exceptions. This is all technical, but for entering into or the performance of a contract. Less technical is the issue when it's permitted by a member state's legislation. And the third issue, which is interesting, is that it's permitted if the data subject has offered his or her explicit consent. Now, of course, the concept of consent in the employer-employee relationship is questionable, whether that is real consent, whether a worker can give consent in a situation where there's such an imbalance in power between workers and employers. In the EU, again, you have the EU Platform Work Directive, which I think has helped us forward in that discussion. I think it makes improvements on the GDPR in terms of explaining what decisions precisely are permitted, are not permitted, and also what human oversight looks like. But of course, the Platform Directive only applies to platform workers, so there's a limited number of workers actually covered by that directive. Second issue that I want to highlight as a risk, I think, is data protection and privacy, because we're talking about tools here that collect a lot of information that rely on data to function. And again, I think even in the EU, where we have the GDPR, there are gaps. I'm not a lawyer, but as far as I understand it, the GDPR actually leaves the issue of employee data protection to be addressed at the member state level. And apparently there are many EU member states that have no employment-specific provisions in their data protection laws. And so here again, we come against the challenges of what data can we collect? I mean, employers, can they rely on legitimate interest? And of course, this opens a whole can of worms. As I mentioned before, consent for data collection, again, makes little sense because of this power imbalance between employers and employees. And I mean, there are many other issues. One obvious one is that many data protection and privacy laws are general data protection and privacy laws, so not specific to the workplace. So we're entering in a situation here where any workplace grievances would have to be raised with data protection authorities rather than with say labor courts, as we do with other issues to do with labor law and infringements of workers' rights. And of course, this is for the EU, but often gaps in data protection and privacy law are even greater in other OECD countries. So to summarize, I think these two are, for me, where the biggest issues are at the moment, and especially given how rapidly the adoption and use of these tools is increasing.
Yeah, and I think if I could just add part of one of the things that I'm noticing, at the Global Partnership on AI, which is, linked to the OECD, is that you're right. A lot of the regulation, there's gaps, whether it's on the algorithmic management side, whether it's on the privacy data protection side. But a lot of those are being exacerbated by the fact that there's a systemic change with algorithmic management that ultimately, like you were emphasizing, before you would go to a labor court to speak about an issue that you had with, but now we're talking about data privacy rights. It's what is the computer system doing rather than what the human is doing. And that's a huge shift in management, but that's a huge shift also in workers' rights and that power imbalance, which becomes even greater. And I think you emphasize it well. There's a great report by the GPI on Amazon warehouse workers, where it was a collaboration between Amazon, the union, and workers. and it discussed some of the realities of algorithmic management and what that actually looks like on the field. So I think really great way to inform also that the regulations and how things are thinking about. And to your point also around countries, I'm based in Canada, where we have a huge gap right now where we have a law that was in place to regulate pre-internet, and so pre-cell phones, pre-internet, and now we're talking about AI, which is completely different. And on that note, when we talk about innovation and this global policy perspective, I think it's often really important to kind of take a step into how businesses are innovating and how that shapes the way that they deploy technologies. And I think it's important to have an entrepreneurial side. So I'd love, Sarah, for you to give us a little bit of kind of your perspective. A lot of founders argue that regulation stifles innovation, that it stops it. But I don't know, has the absence of guardrails enabled more exploitative systems, especially in data labeling and gig work? What's your opinion generally on regulating AI and kind of how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I think Janine and Stijn actually did a pretty amazing job in stating what are the challenges we are facing. And when we are speaking about regulations, we always have to try to get some perspective because we are living through that process, right? And we can always look into history and know that we've been here before, through the first industrial revolution, the second one, then the tech revolution in the middle last century. And the key thing is that each wave produce real harms, right? Like from swell labor to child labor to unsafe factories to digital monopolies and so on. And all those harms got regulated. And I think we can all agree that we all benefited from it as a society. But tools aren't the ones deciding the outcomes. People in institutions are the ones deciding the outcomes, right? And that's what we should be also thinking of. The root issue, I think it's been always the same: who had access to and had ownership to capital, and to the means of production, and really pushing for that and thinking how we can actually better distribute that to equalize the balance. It's one thing that I think it's extremely important as we think about how tech evolves. The good thing, though, with AI is that it is slightly different from all those eras we've been through as humanity, and it's because it's one of the most accessible revolutions yet, right? We have more than half of the world global population owning any smartphone, and more than half of that, the population as well, online, meaning that the delivery for that infrastructure is already in most people's hands. And we've been seeing quite an increase in terms of productivity and access to what technology is building, which differs a lot from things that we've seen in the past. But don't get me wrong, I think harms matter, and those harms need to be not only point out but regulated. And we should regulate high risk practices, and think about outcome-based bans and audits and so on. But it's important, in my opinion, to not confuse regulating those outcomes with regulating the tool itself, because I think that's where we might lose as society, and thinking of how we can distribute that ownership and that access to actually put power or equalize the power balance in a way that we can all benefit from it.
I mean, I think it's a very inspiring perspective, especially somebody who's building a business and is very conscious of the impact that you're making, but also is looking for, I think you really summed up two hats that you wear. One is as a citizen that wants to make sure that society is better, and then as a businesswoman and leader who's trying to build in an environment which is, needs stability and also needs to be focused on what needs to be regulated rather than regulating everything. I think again, an entrepreneurial perspective is always fascinating, this conversation, because sometimes it grounds us in a very different one. And one of the other places that I think is really interesting, and where I want to get a perspective on the tension between innovation and regulation, is with our final panelist. So Stefan, I know that you're studying a lot of these tensions from a theoretical standpoint. I'd like to get your perspective on how do we design regulatory frameworks that can actually protect workers while remaining flexible enough for technology innovation. So really merging the points that Janine, Stijn, Sarah were bringing, and how from an academic perspective are you viewing that, and how does that fit together?
Thank you so much, Alex, and everyone else. This is really exciting. And as you were just saying, Alex, so I heard tangents quite a bit, and also uncertainty. So I wrote down a couple of quotes here. So Janine said, "One can't wait until it happens," and Sarah said, "We're living through the process right now." And I believe from a regulatory perspective, and from a business perspective, for that matter, that's the big challenge we're facing here. And obviously, I can't give you an answer of how this is done, but I want to talk a little more about the problem space and the regulatory options that exist. So my first point is, and perhaps it's a little obvious, but still I want to conceptualize it a little, is that we're looking at balancing tensions between different goals that are being pursued and different approaches. So one general key challenge in regulatory efforts is that they're trying to achieve different things. Like we heard privacy, and privacy sometimes opposed to functionality, security versus accessibility, individual rights versus social welfare, regulatory speed versus data-driven decisions. That's a big one right now. Do we wait until we have data and think it's too late, or is there something about being fast? At a general level, this is about control versus innovation, and I do understand that's an important issue, Sarah, for you and your specific situation. So the problem now is that there's no catch-all solution, and it's about balancing different options that exist in some way. So on the one hand side, rules can protect workers, but rules are outdated very soon. Principles may provide some freedom, but principles typically provide less guidance. There's this idea of technology specificity, and I could hear, Sarah, you said, don't regulate the tool, regulate the outcomes. But still, there's something about technology specificity because it might create some control. And then there's this idea of technology neutrality on the other hand. So that's one big tension, and we could continue these different approaches. The second important issue that I want to raise is that this is a socio-technical phenomenon that we're looking at. So it's not just about, say, outcomes, because AI systems are always embedded in some organizational context. There's power relations, and technology matters. And I believe this is something that we've seen over the past 2-3 years when general purpose AI became increasingly important and had to be accommodated for in regulatory frameworks like the EU AI Act. So my position is that we cannot really conceive of outcomes and processes and the associated risks if we do not consider the technology in some way. And in some way doesn't necessarily mean regulating some specific implementation, but it can mean looking at specific requirements when it comes to reporting and these different things. And I believe this is again open to debate. So what this means in practice. And then finally, that's my third thought on this is there's this need for building flexibility and adaptability into the regulatory system. Whatever we conceive of artificial intelligence to be right now will change. The risks that we see now as risks and are written down in, say, the EU AI Act will not change necessarily, but there's going to be new risks that we can't even anticipate at this point. There's something about the nature of artificial intelligence that leads to that situation. It's being retrained, it's being redeployed in different contexts. There's new architectures emerging. So static regulatory models will not capture this. And that's leading us, and then I'll be done in a second, into another area of tensions, because there's all these different approaches out there, but what we're missing is some comprehensive framework that tells us in what situation what approach should be applied in what specific way. So there's layered regulation. Stijn spoke about human in the loop, and we're trying to figure out what that actually means as AI is evolving. There's something that's called algorithmic regulation. It's kind of the twin to algorithmic management, and that might actually help to get on top of some of the issues related to speed and adaptability. possibility, but still it's something that's emergent. There's regulatory sandboxes, and quite a couple of other approaches. So I believe if workers should be protected from harm, there's immediate harm and what we can do now, but there's also this what is going to be in the future, and regulatory choices that we're making now will actually impact on that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of things to unpack from what you were mentioning, especially around the concept of, control versus innovation, there being no catch-all, and the fact that everything is constantly changing and these new risks are bringing new regulatory burdens or at least new problems. And I think that's a really good kind of, well, maybe I'll bring it back to Janine actually. Like, the ILO has promoted for a long time these global norms around decent work. Do you think international labor standards are fit for purpose in the age of AI?
Yeah, I do. I think because international labor standards are also a process, and within the international labor standards, we have governance mechanisms, and the governance mechanisms that the constituents of the ILO, so the governments, the employers' organizations, and the workers' organizations, those governance mechanisms can affect firm level decisions all the way to international and national decisions. So, first off, we have our fundamental principles and rights at work. So there's 5 fundamental principles and rights at work. 2 of these are particularly relevant to this discussion. One is on occupational safety and health, so the right to a safe and healthy workplace, and the other one, the right to no discrimination. So those are 2 issues that are really important for AI discussions, and all 187 member states of the ILO, by virtue of their membership, need to abide by these fundamental principles and rights at work. So right there, that gives an important umbrella framework for discussions around AI. Then we also have ongoing discussions about other issues as they emerge. And last year we had the first year discussion of a 2-year standard setting discussion on decent work in the platform economy. So this will conclude next June, and there might be an international labor standard regulating platform work, and that would of course address issues such as algorithmic management and the use of AI in platforms. We also have on the agenda to have a tripartite expert meeting discussion. So that's like the first step in a possible standard setting discussion on the issue of workers' personal data in the digital age. Back in 1997, the ILO issued a code of practice on workers' personal data, kind of more for the analog age. But now there's been recognition by our constituents. This is requested of the constituents to have a discussion about this for these times. So this can also inform, and of course, all of this international work informs national legislation. But what I think is really important is the governance conventions that I mentioned in the beginning, because the ILO's raison d'etre really is founded on this notion of social dialogue. Everything is through a tripartite discussion, and so much of what happens in AI. On the one hand, you can have national level legislation, but you can also be using collective bargaining, which is a type of regulation, to decide on certain uses for a particular sector, occupation, or even particular enterprise. So with that gives employers and workers more flexibility on how they can fine tune the regulatory process for the specificities of that particular sector or occupation. So this is something that is really important, because so much of the way that AI affects people at work is really how it's integrated. So if you have German works councils that have to be informed when technology is integrated, and then they have a say on how that technology is integrated, that can be a really important way of ensuring that technological integration is positive, not just for the firm in terms of increasing productivity, but also positive for working conditions, because often the 2 go hand in hand. So yeah, thanks.
I think it's really fascinating that you're also bringing into the fold this concept of collective bargaining as a tool in the regulatory process, which I think people oftentimes forget about, that actually is a very strong tool to move things forward. And Sarah mentioned earlier some of the main breaking points or movements around industrial revolutions, et cetera. And part of the regulation was really driven by the collective bargaining process and kind of workers coming together to talk about that. And so if we go from like this concept of standards, I'd like Stijn to get your perspective on from the OECD viewpoint. We talked about kind of collective bargaining is almost like an alternative to regulation, but what are some of the alternatives to regulation that you're seeing, and are they, in your opinion, effective?
Thanks, Alex. Before I get into that issue, one thing that I do want to emphasize is that there is already in all countries regulation that will apply to AI, and I think we mustn't forget that. So most countries will have regulation on data protection and privacy, on discrimination, on employment protection, on product safety, liability, on occupational safety and health. And I think all these regulations will, to some extent, apply to AI. So AI does not operate in a regulatory vacuum. So it's not no regulation or regulation. I don't think that's the choice here. There is regulation, and I think in some instances, it's about clarifying the existing regulation and what it means for employers. That's really important. In some cases, there might be gaps. And I think often when we talk about AI, we are talking about new regulation. And I don't think there are many countries so far that have introduced new regulation. I think the EU, to some extent, is an exception to this. And there are arguments for and against this. But I think when new regulation, when countries are thinking of new regulation, I think there's a number of things that they need to think about, which is, I think it's been mentioned by Sarah before, are we regulating the technology or applications of it? Also, whatever regulation we introduce, will it be proportionate to the risks? I think that's something else. And the EU AI Act does that to some extent by having a risk-based approach. And then, of course, the other thing that we need to take into account is laws in other countries and what spillovers they have. Because whatever happens, like the GDPR had spillovers to other countries, the EU AI Act will likely have it as well. And it's not just where AI is used and the regulation, the place where it's used that matters, but also where it's developed. So, for example, in the United States, there regulations around discrimination, the fourth, fifth rule, etc., which then enter into the development of these tools, which then are carried over into tools that we use in other countries. So these international spillovers matter as well. But to come back to your question, I don't think regulation is the only way to address some of the risks that we're talking about. And I think what countries decide to do will depend on their starting point. It will also depend, I think, on what their priorities and preferences are. So for example, we've recently worked on 2 country reviews of AI in the labor market in Japan and Korea. And these are 2 countries that have recently passed AI acts. So they are the second countries in the world, or second and third in the world after the EU, to introduce a comprehensive AI act. But the approach in these countries is very different. It's not so much about introducing new regulation. It's much more something that's based on principles and guidance and voluntary implementation of these principles and guidance. But the reason that works is because there's a different culture also in Japan and Korea, where if the government says you should be doing something, even if it's not regulation, companies are much more to abide by this than in other nations. So just to come back to that point, that it will depend to some extent whether these things are effective on the specific country that we're talking about. And the other thing I do want to highlight, but Janine has already mentioned this, is the importance of social dialogue and especially collective bargaining. And again, this will depend from country to country. In some countries already, large parts of how the labor market is regulated is not through legislation, but through collective agreements. And in some countries, that might also be the best way of addressing some of the challenges that AI brings.
Yeah, I think it's the points that you made are really extremely relevant around this. A few concepts, one of them being the spillover legislation, especially with the EU and GDPR in the past, showcasing that specifically, and that how some countries have to finally, interact with laws that are not, in their own jurisdiction. The different cultural aspects of actually setting into place law, that it's not just because something is written in one country that it necessarily will be applied the same way. And finally, that concept of multiple different ways of seeing how the work environment is impacted, not just by regulation, but this whole dialogue that's happening that Janine was also mentioning. I think one of the things that I'd like to get is a perspective in practice. The private sector often has to, live with the choices of regulators and these kind of different the consequences afterwards on their business. So Sarah, I'd like to get your perspective on, maybe flip it a little bit. What are the upsides of AI for work? And, is that equalizing the balance of power? And I'd like to maybe spin it in a positive way and get your perspective on that.
Yeah, for sure. But before doing so, I think it's super interesting what you just mentioned that Alex and Stijn brought to the table as well. And I think looking through a more plural and diverse perspective also allows us to think that harms are different as well in different countries. I am a Latin American woman. I've been born and raised in Brazil, and I see that the impact that we have with AI, and when we think even about like the challenges with deepfake and fake news and so on, and that impact that has also on worker lives and how they actually interact with society, as how we all actually interact with society. It's something that it's always in my mind, right? Like, so I think like what Stefan said about no processes fitting no, or no rules fitting no, it's completely true for the moment we are living through. But getting into the more positive spin towards AI, and I think for things like for situations like that, I think like the only reason why we are focused on discussing the harms and the challenges that we are facing during this process, it's because it's also an extremely powerful tool, right? It's because it also brings a lot of benefits, and this is probably the main reason why AI is such an important part of, I'd imagine, every single person hearing this call. We've been impacted by it, and most of us at least using it in some capacity that has been helping us to perform our work better. I think, and Stijn can correct me if I'm wrong, I think there is a study conducted by OECD that actually states that economic macro models estimate that AI could add 0.5 to 3.5 percentage points to labor productivity per year for over the next decade. So if we're able to actually shift that wage of growth and canalize that productivity into more competitive wages, more access to opportunities, even better opportunities in that sense, we are looking into a extremely interesting and powerful process as humanity, and that AI can lift productivity. I think I don't need to be restating that much. I know that we all have that understanding at some capacity, but one thing that I would love to kind of remark in terms of lifting productivity is that we've seen that happening even more with newer workers, and especially when we think how that can improve their performance and get them to that next level of wages and higher wages and better compensation, just because they have the support and the tools that can reduce their learning curve. So that's one of those things that I see that AI brings a huge upside to the discussion. And the third thing that I would love to remark, and I think that's the one that it's closest to us at Mappa, is that the compute power that we are experimenting allow us to actually, for the first time, I'd be saying, really target the information asymmetry problem, really distributing information in a way that both sides of the coin can actually have some power during decision-making processes. I'm not saying this is perfect, and I agree with my colleagues here when we say that there are power balances and power dynamics that are now resolved, and that might never be resolved if we are completely honest. But I do think that AI really helps us to add new data points to each single discussion that will allow for new power to be unlocked. At Mappa, for example, when we analyze behavior, we are creating a way for workers not to be judged only by their CV or where they studied or where they come from, but rather what they bring to the table, what's the real compatibility with that institution, and giving the worker the right to decide if that institution is the right place for them based on that company's values and way of working. So I think if we can focus on how we distribute the power through the access the AI provides, and I speak back to my first comment on AI being slightly different from other tech and technological and industrial revolutions we have ever had, is that it is more accessible. I know, and listen, like I've been building this. I know it's still extremely expensive, but hardware is not as expensive as it used to be. Software is much more expensive at this point. And more and more people have access to the hardwares that will allow them to access that infrastructure and build upon that infrastructure and get information through that infrastructure. So I think channeling the conversation through how we can increment the access to both capital, power, and ownership. It's for me a very interesting framework to actually discuss the power and the impact that AI can have in the next decades.
And I think you're bringing a lot of really important, interesting points, which is if you take it from a global perspective, more people have access to AI now than ever. If it increases productivity, gives access to new types of jobs, that could be an incredible force. And I think it ties back also to some of the points Janine was raising initially, which is like the impact on labor markets in the developing countries and how it's disproportionately impacting women. So there's a positive and a negative view, and there's ways that we have to think about this more broadly. I think Stefan, you're going to be the last one to speak today because we have 5 minutes left. And so, I want to broaden the lens, I think, to some of the research that you're doing and some of the questions that you're raising about the broader meaning of AI. That's, through these discussions, from a perspective of labor standards, in AI, AI can be seen as a disruptor, an alternative, if we frame it as a management innovation, and essentially it could be even a helpful tool. So it's so many different things, and the meaning is kind of murky and mucky a little bit. So are these different governance approaches that we've been discussing and the different elements creating different versions of what AI actually is? And I'd love to get your academic perspective on that.
Thank you so much, Alex. And I believe you're bringing up an important point, and I would like to relate it to what Sarah just said. Sarah, you said a couple of times the AI revolution is different than previous disruptions that we had. And AI is a very powerful tool, and that might democratize decision making. That's what I heard, and I agree. So it is very different. And I believe in order to be able to understand the discourse and contribute to that ongoing discourse, we need to ask a question about what is it that we mean by artificial intelligence. And also, when I pick up on what Stijn said a little earlier, it's not always obviously not about new regulation, but also about clarifying what regulations exist and what they mean for artificial intelligence. We have to raise a question about boundary conditions. And my sense is that it's not only that business is defining what artificial intelligence is, but also the discourse around regulation is effectively defining what artificial intelligence is, and will shape how the technology can develop and what the technology is going to become over time. And you mentioned different perspective, Alex, like labor standards, a managerial perspective. So from a labor standard perspective, and apologies if I mistake anything here, Janine, but AI may be seen as a huge disruptor. From an innovation perspective, it might perhaps also be seen as a disruptor, but it's something that can be managed. From a managerial rationalism perspective, it might be something that's augmenting work and increasing efficiency. So we're focusing on different aspects of the technology. And the very moment someone regulates the technology, and now I am getting back to the EU AI Act, we're actually saying something about what it is and what the boundary conditions are. So in the EU AI Act, what is fairly prevalent is this idea of inference and this idea of autonomy, and then the question of what is not conceived as artificial intelligence. And my last point really is that if regulation impacts, and of course it is also being impacted by what happens in business practice, but if regulation shapes what the technology will be, then the question is who's involved in making these regulations. So whose voices, if you will, are heard in writing these regulations. And I guess that's what's bringing us back to what was our point of departure, and that's a worker perspective. So what are feasible ways in including those who effectively work with these technologies that are going to be impacted across these varieties of settings that we've heard? So how to actually involve them in these processes and give them a say in shaping what the technology effectively means and becomes. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you. I mean, Janine, Stijn, Stefan, Sarah, thank you so much for the insight, for your different perspectives, for bringing to bear the research that you're doing and the thoughts. I mean, this is years of thinking that comes out in a few sentences, and so there's a lot of nuance and a lot of thought. I think as closing remarks before we get thrown back into the main room, I think we're all in agreement, or we're at least seeing that workers are being impacted by AI. That's distributed differently around the world and is both an opportunity and a risk. That regulatory gaps still remain, but as the last point we were making, it depends how you define AI and what you see as regulation and how you see those perspectives. And so it's important to be nuanced about that. And I think maybe, and a hopeful note is that I think the future is still potentially bright, and there is an opportunity for us as policymakers, as leaders, as researchers, as founders and executives at companies, or even just people thinking about these issues, to try to make it have a positive impact on the workplace, on the workforce, and on how companies shape their duties towards their people. And I think if we can leave on that note, that would be fantastic. So thank you so much, everybody. And I wish you a wonderful day, and I hope you have productive conversations and lots of sparks to bring up some great ideas today. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you.